There was a leader who actually studies leaders who fall morally. He said that the two main things that he found are, number one, they didn't have any deep friendships. Like, that's huge. They didn't have deep friendships. And two, they didn't have any life-giving hobbies outside of their work.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Mullins Muster Podcast, where we talk about all things leadership, and we talk about it with industry-leading experts. As always, if we're adding value to you, your life, your family, your organizations, please let us know. Do us a favor, leave a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast. If you'd like to watch the podcast, you can do so on the Humble Leader Development YouTube page. This episode is brought to you by the fine people at Humble Leader Development. Humble Leader Development is a leadership organization that strives to make people and organizations better through speaking, training, and consultation. If you want to find out more about Humble Leader Development, check them out at humbleleaderdevelopment.com. This is part 2 of my interview with Doug Smith. If you have not listened or watched the first part of this interview, I'm going to tell you to stop what you're doing right now, put everything down, hit pause, go back and listen to last month's episode, part 1 with Doug Smith, and that will help lay the foundation for where we're going in part 2 as we talk about some work-life harmony, how to make sure we're keeping the main things, and he goes through some of his personal struggles with depression and overcoming that, and how he got back into the work routine when he thought that he may never work again. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of my interview with Doug Smith. We talked about your L3 stuff. How hard is it to juggle those two different things? A lot of people out there are thinking about starting their own business, whether it's in leadership or whatever the case may be, but they don't quite have the means or maybe not the time to do so yet, or they're hesitant just because of the demands that it may take, but they still have a family and bills to pay, things like that. So how do you manage keeping that harmony between the two jobs and a home life, right? I don't like to call it balance because I don't think there's any such thing as balance. Right. But how do you maintain that harmony between those?
Yeah. So I think, one, you have to look at what season of life that you're in. So I would say that in the beginning, Jeremy, we were just talking about this, how, you're just starting off and you're editing your own podcast. And man, I remember that season. I don't even know. I think I edited my own podcast for like 7 years, which is a long time. But, when I first started the podcast and started L3, my wife and I didn't have kids. And so, we'd work and, we'd have dinner together, and then I could basically just hustle all night and just work on L3, and I would go hard. But then we started having kids. And I remember mentors telling me like, hey, you're going to start to have kids now. I don't know if you're going to be able to do both. And at first, my attitude was like, well, watch this. You don't know me. You might not have the capacity to do it, but I do. That was my attitude. But I would just say that once I got into a season that it wasn't sustainable for me to do both at the level I was doing it, because I had children, and my wife and I do try to protect our evenings. Like I don't actually do barely any L3 work now throughout the week. Saturday's kind of my day. I put a few hours in. And how I've had to grow as a leader is I've had to develop L3 to a place where I could actually hire a team, because I know I'm not supposed to do this full time, but I do know that the things we're doing make a significant impact, and I don't want to lose the momentum that we have with those things. And so Dan Sullivan wrote a great book that I'd recommend that everyone reads. It's called Who Not How. And the whole principle is, oftentimes as entrepreneurs, or when we're starting a side hustle or even just starting our own business, we ask how. Like you're asking, man, Doug, how do you balance all of this? Like, how do you do the podcast, and how do you do mastermind groups, and how do you do a one-day conference? And he said, the question you should be asking isn't how. And if you found something that you can't do, that you can't figure out the how, the answer isn't a how, the answer is a who. And so the reality is there's someone out there that has that skill set, or that has that passion, that can do it way better than you can do. And so you need to hire that person. Now, in the beginning, and it's not like L3 is making all this money on the side for me now, but in the beginning, I had no money. And the season that I was in, I needed who's to help me. And so I really, even though we were an LLC, I recruited people who were passionate about leadership development and developed teams of volunteers that could help run the breakfast, that could help manage everything, because I couldn't. Now we are in a place where I would say you should, especially if it's a side business, you do need to figure out how to monetize your business, especially if you want to do it full time. For me, I need funding for L3 to keep it going by hiring people. And so now we have an executive assistant, Ashley, who does all of my email and calendar and podcast scheduling and logistics. We have a team that runs and produces our podcast for us. So outside of having the podcast conversations and basically casting vision and selling it to people, I don't really have to do anything with L3. And then so that's how I balance it. I've had to hire people to help balance it. And then I guess if I'm ever to go full time, I'll just need to figure out how to, increase that funding enough where I can take care of myself on my own salary.
That is a phenomenal book, and I will also recommend it to anybody who's interested, because it really changes how you approach things.
Oh, Jeremy, I would just add that's something also my wife and I have asked at home in our personal lives that's really helped us. So my wife also is an executive and works full time, and we have 3 kids and 1 on the way. And so who do we have that can help us around the house? Who do we have that, and so we pay for daycare for our children, and we hire a nanny, and we pay for delivery for our groceries, so we don't have to spend time doing groceries. Now we're in a position to do that, fortunately, which I know is a privilege, but it's just asking those same questions. How can I be as efficient as possible so I can spend as much time with my kids or whatever my priorities are? There's ways to do it. You just have to get creative.
As leaders, we oftentimes kind of burn candles at both ends. And we're kind of talking about that some now and finding some of that harmony, and some people don't. Oftentimes we wear that burning candles at both ends as kind of a badge of honor. At your last L3 one-day conference, you released actually on your podcast a talk that you gave about self-care. And you kind of took us through that personal journey of burnout. So do you mind sharing some of that with our listeners? Because I think it's so important that we kind of know how to lead ourselves well, because oftentimes we overlook that and we put needs of others before ourselves. So do you mind just kind of unpacking that just a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mentioned that I lost my sister to an overdose, which is obviously extremely tragic in my life in 2019. And basically, when my sister passed away, I remember I got the call from my dad in the middle of the night, and he let me know, Doug, Sarah's gone. And I mean, obviously, man, just devastated. But I remember my dad needs help. And so I get in my car, I drive over to my dad's house. I cried for 30 seconds. I get to my dad's house. My dad is understandably a mess. I help my dad. We get through the night. I start planning the funeral. I put together a message because I was going to speak at the funeral. I put together a fundraising plan to raise money for my nephews. And all of that happened very, very quickly. And then I basically just went back to work. And fast forward about 9 months, I came back from a vacation and I had an anxiety attack. Now, I had had 2 other seasons of severe anxiety attacks that lasted probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 months each at 2 other times in my life. One was drug related, and then one was when I was in high school as well. But so 2 different times. And so I had an anxiety attack, didn't think much of it. And then I started moving into a season of anxiety, which I thought, oh man, I don't want to go through this again. And then after about a month of having anxiety attacks, I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like the anxiousness that was in my chest went to my head. And I experienced these feelings that I've never felt before in my entire life. I still can't tell you what was wrong with my mind, but it got me to a place where I literally couldn't work. I remember finishing a meeting with my team and I just said, I can't do this. I took a week off of work. I couldn't even read an email. And literally, I was so scared. I literally thought I was never going to be able to work again. It was the darkest season of my life. I never was suicidal, but I thought I was going to die because I thought I cannot live like this with whatever this feeling is in my brain. And so when you're going through a crisis in your life, you do everything you can to get help. And so I just started reaching out to as many people as I could to get help. And God used those people very significantly in my life. And I started going to therapy, which was absolutely huge. If you would have asked me prior to that, about going to therapy, I would have told you, well, hey, I'm in mastermind groups. I go to church. I have plenty of community around me. That's my therapy. But it certainly, now looking back, didn't replace. I needed a therapist. So I started seeing a therapist and meeting with some of the mentors who knew me dearly. And I'll just share a few things that were takeaways. But a few things that really led me to that season of burnout and grief and anxiety was, number one, my therapist said, Doug, I don't think you've ever grieved the loss of your sister. And I'm going to go out there as far as to say, I don't think you've ever grieved the loss of your mom. And that, I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, I feel like I'm fine in dealing with that. And he's like, I don't think you are. And I was meeting with another mentor, and he said, Doug, your mom got sick when you were in middle school, and you basically watched your mom get sick and get worse and worse and ultimately die over a long period of time as a teenager. And you medicated the pain of that through drugs and alcohol. And then you got saved and gave your life to Christ, and you turned your life around, which is great. But basically, instead of numbing your pain through drugs and alcohol, you basically started doing it through performance and performing. And that hit me so hard. And on the grief side, what my therapist recommended was, Doug, you need to go. He said about grief, he said, Doug, you can't say goodbye to something that you've never said hello to. And he said, so what I want you to do is I want you to go to the grave sites of everyone that you've lost. And I've lost my sister, my mother-in-law, my mother, and both of my grandparents. And I want you to go to their grave sites, and I want you to write each of them letters. And I never visited their gravesite after their funeral. I thought it was stupid. I'm like, they're not there. What's the point? And I just remember going to my sister's gravesite and starting to write. And I just started weeping. God ended up, just speaking to my heart some things that I needed to hear. And it was such a freeing experience. And that's when I realized that grief is an intentional act. It's not something that just happens over time. You have to be intentional about it. And for the first time in my life, I actually grieved the loss of everyone that I've lost in my life. And that was absolutely huge. The second thing went back to performance. And as I mentioned, I never thought I would be able to work again. And I started talking to my therapist, and I said, talk to me about capacity, because I feel like I have no capacity, but I feel like I used to have all the capacity in the world. And he said, Doug, oftentimes, when it comes to burnout and people not being able to do things, it's not a capacity issue. He's like, there's people who sleep 4 hours a night, and they've been doing that for their entire lives. They're in their 70s and 80s, and they have all the capacity in the world, and they can perform all fine. They can perform fine. What I usually find when people burn out is it's usually them having unrealistic expectations of themselves internally. I'll say it again, because that was huge for me. They have unrealistic expectations of themselves internally. And, we talked about me putting all this pressure on myself and finding my identity in the numbers. The expectations that I was putting on myself in every area of my life in that season were ridiculous. Financially, it was like, if I'm not Dave Ramsey and a multi-millionaire at this point in my life, like I'm worthless. In the leadership space, if I don't have as much influence as John Maxwell right now in my life, like I am not a leader. You take any area physically, if I don't look like The Rock, if I don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, then I am not physically fit, I'm fat. And that was literally the standard that I would hold myself to in every situation in my life, at work, etc. Not to mention, I was new to this role as director of development. It was the first time I felt the weight as a leader of, hey, if I don't raise these funds, if I don't lead my team well, then it's not going to be a good day for our organization. And so I never had to process pressure like that before. And so I've really had to let go of all expectations of myself. Now, I still have goals. I still go hard. I'm just not as hard on myself internally. If I have a bad day, or if I mess up, or if I drop the ball, I give myself a lot more grace than I would have prior. And so that was huge. And there were some other lessons. The other one I would just say is, when I started reaching out to, and this is so important for leaders, when I started reaching out to some of my friends who are closest to me, I basically asked them to go on walks. And it was so funny. I walked with them all individually, and they all basically said the same thing to me. They said, Doug, you've been neglecting deep friendships for a long time. And they were like, who I consider my best friends. They're like, you don't make time for friends, and you need to do that. And, one of my mentors said, Doug, who do you know? Like, who are the friends that you have in your life that don't know you as the director of development at Light of Life, who don't know you as the founder of L3 Leadership? They just know you as Doug, or, my nickname for a long time was Bubba. Like, who are those who just know you as Bubba, some young punk kid that was a ball of potential? Like, those are the people you need to connect with on a consistent basis. And so I made an intentional effort to really start developing deep friendships and making time for my friends. And that was huge. And I have to mention this one as well. And well, let me just say, I actually just listened to a podcast that I thought was so good. There was a leader who actually studies leaders who fall morally. Like when someone falls morally, like he takes a deep dive into why it happened. And he said that the two main things that he found are, number one, they didn't have any deep friendships. Like that's huge. They didn't have deep friendships. And two, they didn't have any life-giving hobbies outside of their work. And I'll just use the hobbies thing as a segue to, I didn't have any hobbies in my life, and I did not rest in my life. I went hard all the time. And so I read a book at the time called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. And it was the first time in my life I started implementing a Sabbath, which is one day a week where you don't do anything work related, which has been huge for me. I've been taking 2-week vacations. I've been unplugging from work basically when I get home at night. I've made a lot of changes and added a lot of rest into my life, which has also required me to rely a lot more on who's, as we were talking about earlier. I've had to rely a lot more on other people, which is probably a good thing, that I've had to let go of some things. I was probably too much of a control freak over things that I didn't need to be a control freak over. So darkest season of my life. If anything that I just shared can help prevent a leader listening to this, when I shared that talk at L3 one day, I was shocked at how many leaders came up to me in tears after I shared the talk and just said, Doug, I'm either headed for that season and I'm so close to it, or I'm going through it now. Can you help me? And so if what I just shared can help prevent you from ever going through what I went through, or it can get you through it, and then this was worth it. And I would just tell you that if you are going through that, you're not alone. There's millions. In fact, one of my mentors, when I went through this, he said, Doug, I don't know a leader that leads at the level you're leading at that hasn't gone through something like this. And if they didn't go through something like that, they probably ended up in moral failure and left leadership anyway. And so just realize that you're not alone. Other people have gone through what you're going through and have gotten through to the other side. There is another side. I'm living on the other side of it now. And so don't give up. Don't quit. There's more in you. There's a better tomorrow. Just keep getting up again and keep moving forward, and reach out to those friends in need. Do everything you can to get out of this season.
I appreciate you sharing that, man. That is good stuff. Just as you were talking, I'm taking notes, and a lot of parallels there for myself. I haven't hit that point,
Yeah.
but just as you talk, I'm like, maybe I need to go back and start relooking at some things in my own life. I definitely appreciate you sharing that. So
Absolutely.
I'll ask you one more question, man. You hit on it earlier, just briefly. You talked about your mastermind group out in Montana, and you recently did a silent retreat. What was that like? When I think of a silent retreat, or I think when others hear that term, they're like, "Am I just going to sit somewhere and do nothing and just wait to hear from God, or are you fishing? Or doing some
Yeah.
hiking? Just like, what did that silent retreat look like? I know you said there was a couple hours of prayer and worship, but outside of that, what were some things that you did to kind of open up your ears to the voice of God?
Yeah. So one, the mastermind retreat, or I call it the pastormind, it was not by myself. And while I was with the rest of the group, it was not a silent retreat. So I ended up doing a silent retreat, which I'll talk about. But I would just say that for me, if I wouldn't have had the retreat with the guys on the front end, the silent retreat wouldn't have been as effective, because this was the first time in my life we prayed and worshiped for every day for 2 hours. And for me, it was turning on worship music, learning that I need to stand up and pace around when I worship, and then going into prayer. Like I never thought I could pray for an hour or two, but I did. And when I did that and I got quiet, it was crazy how much clarity started coming to me from God and what that time was like. And that was with the guys. We also had two leaders come in and invest in us and pray over us and share a word. So that was really, really, really good. And that kind of set the tone for my silent retreat. So at the end of the week, I took a few additional days. And it's obviously, if you can take a silent retreat, Montana is not a bad place to do it. But with the guys, we spent that time in the morning with God, which was great. And then we basically just had fun the rest of the time. We did go fly fishing. We went hiking. We did all kind of fun stuff. So the rest of the day was mainly fun. When I did my silent retreat, again, everywhere I go, I bring my journal with me. I usually bring a book that I'm reading. And so this particular time, I woke up. I actually spent time in my hotel room, just praying and worshiping. Same thing I did with the guys. Turned on worship, prayed for an hour or two, and then for me, I'm a hiker, so I found my bucket list hikes that I wanted to go on, and then I would just hike and be silent while I'm hiking and just think and process. And then when I got to the summit, I did the same thing. I turned on worship music. I got out my journal. I brought my Bible with me, And I was just quiet and worshiped and prayed. And again, God spoke to me. And then basically I just hiked back and, went and had dinner and just got quiet. And so it was just tuning out the world, turning off all the media, unplugging completely, and just letting God speak. And I would just say it wasn't as scary as I thought it would be all these years leading up to it. Because like you said, what am I going to do? Am I just going to sit there and stare at a book? But for me, I think part of it's just learning how you were wired as a leader. A pastor recently told me of like, hey, I just know when I pray, I have to stand up and pace and worship. And when thoughts come to me, this is big. If thoughts come to you for work, that's why you bring your journal with you. Part of the reason, write those thoughts out. Oh, I have to do this. Because then if you get those thoughts out of your head and onto paper, you can always go back to them, because it often takes a half hour to an hour of just to get your mind still, where you're not like, oh, do I got to do that? And get into planning mode. So that's helpful as well. Just let your mind jot down anything on paper that comes to mind to do.
No, that's great. And that was actually going to be one of the things I asked was, how do you tune out? Because as leaders, we're always thinking about work, right? We're always thinking about what can I do? What's the next step? What needs to get done? And I am just as guilty. There's a lot of times I'm, prayer time. Next thing I know, 20 minutes later, I've been thinking about work for 20 minutes. So that's
guilty.
That's
I'm with you, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me tell you this, because if you would have looked at my life prior to this retreat, my life would have told you that I thought and believed the prayer was a waste of. But when I was with the group and we were having this guy, when we were in a time of prayer and worship, God spoke to my heart. And he said, Doug, for most of your walk with me, you've relied on my word and my wisdom to get you through. And both of those are necessary in your walk with God. But he said, you must, and must was emphasized in my heart. You must lead your family to be a family of prayer and worship. If you don't, your kids and grandkids will not be able to sustain their walk with me. And as a result, your whole family tree will not walk with God. You must teach them to have an intimacy with me in prayer and worship. And he really dealt with me that some things can only be answered and some things can only happen through prayer and worship and fasting. And when I learned that, that really changed even me getting motivated, just realizing, hey, God can speak to me one word in a time of worship and prayer that I give him, then 5,000 leadership books that I read or 5,000 podcasts I listen to. And so just realizing that you have a time to interact with the creator of the universe is pretty incredible. And if we'll take that seriously, he'll speak to us and take us further than we could ever imagine.
Really appreciate all your time here today, man. I feel like we just started this conversation. We're about an hour into it. So I know you have much more important things to do today, to spend time with the family, like you said. And you got to lead them. Well, to lead them, you got to spend time with them. So I thank you for taking a little bit of that time out of your day to spend here with me and our listeners. So I'm super grateful for that. So thanks again for all you do, man. Keep crushing it up there in Pittsburgh with Light of Life and L3. If people want to get in touch with you, how do they do so?
Yeah. Well, and first, Jeremy, I would just say thank you so much for your service, and really proud of you just for taking the launch of this podcast. I remember the days when launching behind. I'm just excited for all the people that you're going to add value to and all the leaders that you're going to impact. So just kudos to you for having the courage to do that. And anything I can do to ever serve you, please let me know. And, people can find me, just my personal website's DougSmithLive.com or at l3leadership.org. And if you're in Pittsburgh or interested in learning more about Light of Life, it's lightoflife.org.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate it, man. So thanks again for being here, brother. It was a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Doug. He brought so much life to our podcast, to our interview, by being vulnerable, showing us what it truly means to struggle as a leader. I'm sure we can all relate to some of the things that he was saying that he has dealt with. Today's Bible verse comes from Jeremiah 17:7-8, and it says, "But blessed are those who trust in the Lord and have made the Lord their hope and confidence. They are like trees planted along a riverbank, with roots that reach deep into the water. Such trees are not bothered by the heat or worried by long months of drought. Their leaves stay green and they never stop producing fruit." Trust in the Lord, and he will take you where he wants you to go. Hey, thanks for joining us. Have a great month, and we'll see you next time on the Mullins Mustard Podcast. Take care, guys.